Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Boscarino. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and I'm here to talk with you today about set shifting as part of the ENIGMA-U neuropsychology lecture series. This is a broad overview of what I plan to discuss today. We'll talk about a general definition of executive functioning and how set shifting fits into it. We'll then discuss the clinical manifestations of set shifting deficits. We'll then move to particular brain regions and neural circuits and networks that are associated with set shifting deficits. I'll then discuss the neuropsychological measures we use to assess set shifting. And finally, I'll talk about some of the clinical implications of set shifting. So executive functioning is an umbrella term, as you can see on the right. It refers to higher order complex thinking skills that help to govern decision-making, planning, organization, set shifting, notably, initiation, sequencing, and so on. They tend to be associated with the frontal lobes, but they are not exclusive to them. So a deficit in executive functioning can occur due to lesions outside the frontal lobe, but they are most commonly seen due to lesions with the frontal subcortical circuits, which we'll get into in a little bit. Now, set shifting and the other sort of aspects of executive functioning interact with one another. So as you can see on the right, there's a lot of both foundational cognitive functions that help subserve executive functioning. And all of these executive functions also interact with one another. So in order to have or to use your executive functions, it requires intact foundational skills. So things like memory, recalling what you need to do, language, understanding what's being told to you, attention, being able to kind of focus on the task at hand. All of this is required to be intact before we can use those sort of higher order skills that kind of build on that bottom-up information coming to us. So again, set shifting is something that requires not only intact kind of foundational cognitive functions as the ones below, but also requires these other executive functions such as metacognition or self-analysis, kind of monitoring kind of what we're doing, cognitive control and sequencing, being able to kind of go back and forth or kind of go in a particular order. All of these things kind of need to kind of interact with each other and be online in order to successfully set shift. And we'll talk about in a bit, there's really a lot of different terms that are used interchangeably with set shifting, such as cognitive control, divided attention. All of these things are similar, but not exactly the same as set shifting, which again, I'll touch on in just a second. So set shifting is really kind of conscious mental switching between tasks or categories. Sometimes these tasks or categories are known in advance, so it's known that you have to switch between two or more categories going back and forth, kind of almost like in a multitasking sort of way. And sometimes they're not. So sometimes it requires you to almost be on your toes a little bit and adapt to new or changing environments. Again, as I kind of spoke about before, in order to mentally switch between tasks or categories, it generally requires intact working memory, so the ability to hold and manipulate information, and intact sequencing of categories, so being able to, again, switch and kind of shift between particular mental sets. It also means that we have to remain on task in light of interference or differing elements. So if there's other things that go on in between, such as we're trying to do one task and then suddenly someone interrupts us or distracts us, we have to be able to then go back to whatever task we were doing or hold in our heads kind of what we were hoping to do, and then be able to switch kind of back and forth nonetheless. And again, this is keeping track of instructions, usually multi-step instructions or complex, lengthier information that we're trying to hold on to. And deficits can result in either recurrent perseverative errors or basically doing the same thing in light of different information, or set loss errors, so not making the correct sequence. So again, with perseverations, you're kind of doing the same thing, even though it's not appropriate to do that particular thing. So if we were doing some sort of neuropsych task, kind of holding on to or drawing the same thing over and over again, even though you're asked to draw something differently. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. Versus not being able to switch to the right thing. So almost, again, kind of missing that piece. So in terms of the neural correlates associated with set shifting, so typically we think of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as being associated with set shifting deficits. So when we think of dorsal, we think of kind of towards the top part of the brain, as opposed to ventral, which kind of refers to more of the bottom part of the brain. And then, excuse me, in terms of lateral, kind of more towards the outside as opposed to medial or towards the middle. So as you can see in this picture in the red, kind of towards this area at the top, kind of top edge, we see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that's one of the main areas that, again, is associated with that set shifting. But as you'll see in a second, it's certainly not solely that area that is, solely in charge of set shifting and kind of maintaining and regulating that working memory stuff. And something to note is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also associated with a lot of different executive functions. So we may not just see solely one set shifting deficit in isolation. There may also be working memory deficits and problems with planning, organization. So again, it's not something that's sort of siloed. And certainly other areas, like I was just alluding to, can also cause set shifting deficits. And so this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex circuit has kind of been pretty well studied in neuropsychology. So there's several different frontal subcortical circuits that are responsible or associated with different executive functions, different sort of behaviors, inhibition, eye movements, that sort of thing. And with that, they all sort of follow a particular pattern. So, with this slide, it may look like a lot, it may look a little bit busy, but the important thing to keep in mind is that all these frontal subcortical circuits follow a similar pattern. So they all have a cortical area. So that's that first part, again, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that it kind of includes Brodmann areas 9, 10, and 46. They tend to include a striatal area, which in this case is the dorsolateral caudate nucleus. That's the second area that is shown here. And then we move down to the pallidus area. So in this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex circuit, we have the globus pallidus interna and externa, substantia nigra, and then the subthalamic nucleus. And then moving from there, we always have a thalamic area in these frontal subcortical circuits. And in particular, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we have the ventral anterior and dorsal medial thalamus. And these always loop back. So they're circuits or networks, remember. So the thalamic part is always looping back to the cortex as a continuous feedback loop. But it's not just those frontal subcortical circuits that can cause executive deficits, and in particular, set shifting deficits. So while lesions in those other sort of white matter tracts or the subcortical parts can also cause those particular problems, there's also other broader networks that expand beyond just frontal and subcortical areas. So what we have pictured here, some of these yellow areas demonstrate that there's other networks that we've seen with stuff like functional MRI, where we can look at patterns of brain activation in response to either particular tasks, or look kind of when these brain areas are activated or deactivated relative to one another, even during resting states. And in particular, this central executive network has been found to kind of encapsulate the main hubs of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as the posterior parietal cortex. So even as expanding as far back as the parietal lobe, what we see is so in the more posterior part of this brain over here, kind of the back end of it, we see that there's an area that also is responsible or plays a role in executive functioning, such as set shifting. So again, we're seeing that certainly not just the frontal lobes are playing a role here in terms of kind of managing and regulating our executive functions, and in particular, set shifting. So important to keep in mind. So some of the neuropsychological measures that we use to assess set shifting are listed over here. I won't go through all of them, but just so you're aware, the picture on the right is the Luria ramparts that is a common bedside test that was often associated with Alexander Luria, who's a very famous neuropsychologist. So what you see at the top, so all of these tests kind of use some sort of set shifting between different categories or sets. Sometimes there's a speed component, sometimes there's not. But in this particular case, what the patient is asked to do for this ramparts sort of task is they're given, you see the sort of square, triangle, square, triangle, square, triangle pattern. And they're asked to continue to draw that. And so patients who have set shifting deficits will often show this perseverative error that I was sort of alluding to previously. So as you can see at the bottom, that's the patient's rendition. And so what they're doing here is they're continuously drawing that square pattern instead of switching back and forth between the square, triangle, square, triangle, square, triangle. So something that is very, I think, readily apparent here, not always as readily apparent sometimes, and can be a bit more subtle. And so some of these other tests, like the Wisconsin card sorting test or trail making test, can be a bit more sensitive, as they tend to be a bit more difficult and may pick up on some of the more subtle deficits that we can see. In this case, our neuropsychological tests that we use to assess cognitive functions are much better than some of the behavioral measures that we have. So with some of our other sort of tests, such as domains such as inhibition, kind of holding back almost the brakes of our brain, our tests are not as good or sensitive at picking up on those particular things. But with behavioral measure, well, with set shifting, I should say, our neuropsychological tests are much more sensitive to that particular subdomain. So the behavioral measures that we have are not as sensitive. While they may pick up on them, and there certainly are some dysexecutive questionnaires that do try to get at aspects of this, it's really our cognitive tests that do a much better job of this. Now, some clinical examples of this. So patients may report to you that they have trouble, they get stuck on a particular task. They may have trouble kind of shifting topics in conversation. They may have difficulties adapting to a changing environment. So some sort of perseverative errors that you might see is that, they had this one particular way of socializing that worked in one environment, maybe, socializing with friends, and they try to employ that, at work or at a more professional setting. So applying something that's not exactly the appropriate setting, but knowing that it worked in the past potentially, to another particular one, almost perseverating on that, and difficulties adapting to potentially, again, a differing sort of environment. Trouble with multitasking or switching back and forth, and having trouble with kind of interference effects. So being more vulnerable to being distracted and losing set, almost losing your train of thought, forgetting kind of what you were doing, getting derailed by some sort of distractor. All of these things are commonly seen in the clinic, and things that sometimes we see patients have a little bit more trouble with. There are some tasks that we'll ask patients to do, where the goal is not to do we'll give a patient, 5 or 6 tasks, and the goal is not to complete each task. They're not given enough time to do that, but rather the goal is for them to complete a little bit of each particular task, just start or initiate it, and then continuously set shift. And we find that patients who make perseverative errors get stuck on doing one particular task. So they'll be sorting a card deck in order, and then they'll kind of get stuck on that, as opposed to doing that and then moving to being able to rearrange a list of names in alphabetical order. And instead of just starting that task, moving on to the next one, moving on to the next one, sort of chipping away at things. What we find is they get stuck on that one thing, and they actually may end up running out of time. So these, again, are all kind of common themes that we may see. Or a patient who is shown a particular memory stimuli. So we ask them to remember a particular drawing, and then we have them draw something else a little bit later, and they end up drawing that same stimuli. So they're almost perseverating on it, or they draw it multiple times as opposed to just the once. So these set shifting deficits can be seen in clinical populations like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, Parkinson's disease, stroke, and traumatic brain injury. I will say with stroke and traumatic brain injury, it sort of depends on where the damage is. So it can be a little bit more variable, but both of those etiologies do tend to affect some of the frontal subcortical circuits. So it can be seen more commonly, despite the fact that there are some more posterior strokes, or the traumatic brain injury may not necessarily affect some of those areas associated with set shifting deficits. So important to keep in mind that real estate does matter a lot, or the sort of areas that are affected. But ADHD, autism spectrum, Parkinson's, those all tend to primarily affect those frontal subcortical circuits. So we'll see patients having a little bit more trouble, again, adapting to new environments, employing new particular strategies to deal with things that kind of come up on the fly, or getting stuck on one particular thing, not being able to be more flexible. And in that vein, kind of as we're talking about this, as you can maybe surmise from this, executive dysfunction really can adversely impact our activities of daily living, or our ability to function day to day, more than deficits in other domains. So certainly not to diminish or downplay deficits in other areas, and we absolutely see those sort of deficits in memory, folks who are amnestic, or patients who are aphasic from a stroke, not able to speak or understand language. We see that certainly impacts functioning pretty severely. But executive dysfunction, sometimes those patients may appear more normal to others who maybe aren't looking for problems with planning, organizing. Sometimes they may appear like those sort of patients are totally fine, and then when it comes to decision making, they have more trouble with that, or when it comes to time management, organization. And so we can really see more of a severe functional impact from that. And a lot of the patient's loved ones may not understand that. So it's sort of our job as neuropsychologists to really be able to pick up on that sort of stuff and relay those concerns, if they're having set shifting problems or other executive deficits, to patients and their loved ones. And in that vein of kind of functioning day to day, we see a lot of times that our tests of set shifting correlate pretty well with driving safety. So being able to adapt to situations on the fly on the road. So really, really important to thoroughly kind of assess this domain of set shifting. It can really have some significant impacts on driving safety. And it's incredibly difficult to be able to predict who's going to be a safe driver on the road, because motor vehicle accidents are a low frequency event, meaning they don't happen very often. It's important nonetheless to be able to predict who may be at risk and who may benefit from undergoing motor vehicle sort of evaluation on the road to make sure that everything is okay. So set shifting is definitely an important area again to assess and be on top of in this vein. As I was talking about before, there's a lot of overlap and influence with executive function deficits on other domains. So we rarely see just set shifting deficits by themselves. There's usually some working memory problems. They're having trouble holding information in their brain. Patients are having difficulty organizing information, keeping it straight. They may have, again, we'll see those sort of interference effects, or they have some retrieval problems. Excuse me, they may need hints or cues. So it's certainly usually not set shifting by itself. And an important thing to keep in mind is that increased structure of neuropsychological evaluations may actually reduce or attenuate our ability to pick up on deficits. So in the structure of an exam room, you're working with an examiner usually one-on-one. So when we're doing the testing, it's usually paper and pencil, and we're working with the patients directly. We're telling them exactly what to do, what we need them to do, and when they should do it. And in the real world, we don't always see that. There's not always someone to tell you exactly what to do. Situations are not always black and white. And so because of that, sometimes that sort of increased structure, when it's imposed on the evaluation and on the person that you're seeing, the patient, they may have a little bit more of some of their executive functions that appear a bit more intact on the current evaluation that you're working with them on. And then outside of that, they may report that they're having more problems than what you're seeing on some of the test data. So an important situational factor to keep in mind. Okay. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I will now practice set shifting on my own. So we will all set shift to the next particular thing that we're on to. So again, best of luck with your learning journey, and thank you for listening.